How do you survive 30 degrees Celsius in total darkness on a volcanic island with almost no trees, no modern insulation, no electricity, and no second chances? Because winter in the Norse world didn't arrive, it ambushed. For months, the sun barely crept over the horizon. Storms came like falling axes without rhythm, without mercy. Winds screamed like something alive. Sheep froze where they stood. Water turned to stone. Food hardened into blocks of ice within minutes. Yet hidden under a roof of soil and grass, men, women, children, grandparents, and animals stayed alive. Not comfortably, not peacefully, but undeniably, unbelievably alive. The question that confounds architects and historians today: how did a civilization with stone axes and turf walls create something more thermally efficient than many structures built 1,000 years later? Because the Viking Longhouse wasn't a home. It was a machine, a biological, architectural, spiritual engine built for one purpose: survival. And the true secret of that machine is something we are only beginning to understand. Historians call it the medieval warm period, but that name deceives more than it explains. Temperatures rose only a degree or two, barely enough to notice on a modern thermostat, yet in the brutal north, that small rise unlocked an entire expansion of human life. Grass grew taller. Seasons stretched longer. Coastal waters calmed just enough for Norse ships to push farther into the unknown. But the warmth was temporary. A gift with a hidden blade. Because in the Arctic fringe, climate doesn't shift gently. It snaps. A single storm could wipe out months of winter preparation. One unexpected freeze could turn grazing land into a killing field. A failed harvest wasn't an inconvenience, it was a sentence. The Norse understood a truth most civilizations forget. Societies don't collapse when temperatures slowly decline. They collapse when one night becomes impossible to survive. So the Viking Longhouse was not built for comfort. It was built as a shield. A fortress engineered for the worst night a human could ever face. The night when nature stopped negotiating. Hollywood paints Vikings wandering through endless forests, axes on their shoulders, trees ready for the taking. But when the Norse stepped onto Iceland and Greenland, they found almost nothing standing. No forests. No timber. No easy materials at all. So they turned to the one resource that never ran out. The earth beneath their feet. Peat blocks carved like bricks. Sod stitched together by living root networks. Layers of clay pressed tight. Soil compacted until it behaved like stone. And driftwood rare, precious, used only when the ocean chose to deliver it. Modern engineers have a name for this strategy: thermal mass. The Vikings had a simpler one: home. Their walls stood over a meter thick, tapering upward to trap rising heat. Their floors dipped partially into the ground, borrowing geothermal stability long before the word geothermal ever existed. The earth became a blanket. Gravity became insulation. Cold itself slowed down as it tried to enter. Nothing about this was primitive. It was survival sharpened into engineering. Brutal, brilliant, and centuries ahead of its time. From the outside, a Viking turf roof looks almost accidental. A mound of earth, a patch of grass, a shape more like a hill than a home. But this was not an accident. It was engineering disguised as nature. The roof followed a precise, almost counterintuitive formula. Grass down, soil in the middle. Grass up. The bottom layer placed the grass facing inward, the roots dangling down like organic insulation fibers. These living tendrils trapped warm air, softened drafts, and acted like a natural acoustic shield. Above it, a dense layer of compacted soil absorbed sunlight during the day and slowly released it through the long, frozen night. It functioned as a battery, primitive in materials, sophisticated in effect. Then came the top layer. Grass again. Alive and growing. Its roots formed a tight, living net that gripped the roof together, anchoring it against storms that could tear lesser structures apart. Even under winter's weight, the turf flexed instead of cracking. And hidden beneath the sod, almost invisible, lay the Vikings' most ingenious touch. Twigs. Thin, flexible, deliberately sacrificial. Their purpose wasn't strength. It was protection. They lifted moisture away from the wooden frame, preventing rot the same way modern builders use moisture barriers and ventilation channels. Today, architects use synthetic membranes, engineered films, and regulated airflow. 1,000 years ago, Vikings solved the same problem with dirt, grass, and a handful of sticks. It shouldn't have worked. But it did beautifully, reliably, defiantly, surviving storms that would crush modern roofs built with far more knowledge and far less humility before nature. Inside a Viking longhouse, survival wasn't just about warmth. It was about elevation, literally. No one slept on the floor, because the floor was where death waited. Cold air sinks. Warm air rises. You don't need a physics textbook to understand that. You just need to live through a Norse winter. So families built raised platforms, anywhere from 1/2 meter to 1.5 meters high. These weren't beds in the modern sense. They were lifelines, wooden shelves of survival that created tiny microclimates in a room that hovered dangerously close to freezing. And the difference those few inches made was astonishing. Archaeologists estimate that just moving a sleeping body a foot or two off the ground could raise the surrounding temperature by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. In our world, that's the difference between discomfort and a cold night. In theirs, it was the difference between frostbite and waking up alive. Families slept side by side, sharing heat, wrapped in wool, fur, and whatever insulation they could gather. Children were placed closest to the warmest spot. The elderly held places of honor not out of sentimentality, but because their survival demanded it. When researchers recreate these longhouses today, one detail stands out above all others: the razor-thin margin between life and death. Less than the height of a dining table. That was the buffer standing between a Viking family and the kind of cold that could end a bloodline. Elevation wasn't comfort. It was strategy, primitive in appearance, advanced in outcome. Another reminder that Viking engineering didn't always look like engineering. But it worked. And that was all that mattered. At the center of every longhouse burned the Langolder, the long fire. A glowing line of embers, stretching through the heart of the room, crackling softly beneath a ceiling darkened by centuries of smoke. But despite what our instincts tell us, this fire was not the main source of warmth. Its purpose was far more complex. It offered light when winter swallowed the sun. It cooked the meals that fueled bodies through months of darkness. It served as emergency heat when the cold pressed too close. And beyond the practical, it became a symbol. A place where stories were told, alliances made, identities formed. The long fire created boundaries. It defined the social center of the home. It reminded every person in that room where the line stood between order and chaos. Smoke curled upward, staining beams a deep tar black. Ash drifted across the packed earth floor. And ventilation, limited by design, kept precious heat from escaping through the roof. To modern eyes, it looks uncomfortable, even dangerous. To the Vikings, it was necessary. The fire did many jobs, but the one job it didn't have was heating the house. Because long after the flames died down, long after the embers cooled and the room fell into darkness, the longhouse stayed warm. The real furnace, the real engine of survival, was alive. It breathed. It chewed. It slept. And it walked on 4 legs. Picture the inside of a Viking longhouse on a January night. 20 sheep pressed together, 2 full-grown cows shifting their weight in the dark, a calf breathing slow clouds of steam, and stacks of hay quietly fermenting in the corner. All of them alive. All of them warm. All of them radiating heat every second of the day. It surprises many people to learn that a single cow produces more warmth than a modern space heater. Multiply that by a room full of livestock, and you begin to understand why the Norse didn't build barns far from home. The barn was the home, or at least its closest neighbor. The animals were separated by walls of wood, not distance. 1 room away, their combined body heat seeped through the structure, raising temperatures enough to push back the killing cold. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't clean. But it was effective. Of course, this came with a cost. Darkness, dampness, and heavy smells were constant companions. Diseases thrived in stagnant winter air. Archaeologists can still see the damage in Viking skeletons' lungs scarred by years of breathing smoke and animal dust. But comfort was not the priority. Survival was. and survival demands allies, even if they bleat, moo, or trample in the dark. To the Vikings, animals were not simply resources, they were co-inhabitants of the winter machine, essential components in a thermal strategy that blended biology with architecture. In the Norse world, insulation wasn't just a building technique, it was a culture, a way of thinking in which everything stone, earth, humans, and animals worked together to keep a community alive when the world outside tried to end them. In a world where winter could last half the year, the Vikings didn't just eat to live, they ate to endure. Every meal was a strategy. Every bite was fuel for a body constantly fighting the cold. Their diet was unapologetically heavy in fat. Thick cuts of seal meat, dense with calories. Whale blubber sliced like butter. Fermented shark with a smell that could challenge even the strongest stomach. Cheese, butter, and cream from hardy northern livestock. Barley beer safer than drinking the water. Dried fish that could outlast the season. And yes, ram testicles fermented in whey. An honest detail of Viking survival food. To modern palates, much of this sounds extreme. To them, it was engineering, biological engineering. Fermentation wasn't a luxury or a flavor adventure. It was a refrigerator without ice. A way to make unstable food last through months of darkness. Smoke wasn't seasoning. It was chemistry, molecular preservation that kept death from creeping into the pantry. Today, diets warn us about fat. The Vikings worshipped it. Because fat burns slowly, feeding the body with steady heat the way a thick log feeds a fire. Carbohydrates spark quickly and vanish. Fat carries you through the night. To survive the North, a Viking didn't just need shelter. They needed a furnace inside their own body. And that furnace ran on fat, rich, heavy, life-saving fat. This was not indulgence. It was survival written on the dinner table. Inside a Viking longhouse, warmth was not evenly shared. It followed lines of hierarchy as clearly as ink on parchment. The chieftain claimed the seat nearest the central fire. Not out of arrogance, but because leadership required strength. Elders and infants stayed close as well, their bodies too fragile to withstand the cold. Unmarried adults and laborers slept farther from the flames, earning warmth through work and resilience. And at the very edges, where drafts slipped in and shadows never left, slept the thralls. Men and women whose status was marked not by chains, but by temperature. In this world, architecture mirrored society. Warmth was privilege. Cold was identity. Life inside this structure was more than physically demanding. It was psychologically relentless. Smoke hung low, turning the air into a gray haze that stung the eyes and scraped the lungs. Livestock shuffled and groaned only a wall away. The darkness felt absolute, broken only by firelight trembling over rough beams. Winter, in this context, wasn't a season. It was an examination, a months-long test of human character, a test of patience, when days blurred together without sunlight, a test of unity, when survival depended on cooperation, a test of conflict management, as cramped quarters magnified every disagreement, a test of discipline, as resources had to last longer than instinct allowed, a test of tolerance for discomfort, which became less an inconvenience and more a way of life. The Viking longhouse did not exist to offer comfort. It existed to shape people into something harder, wiser, and more resilient than the cold trying to kill them. It was not a shelter. It was a forge. To the Vikings, the longhouse was not just a structure engineered for survival. It was a temple, a living symbol of their place in the universe. At its center burned the hearth, the glowing line between chaos and order. In Norse cosmology, the world itself was born between the fires of Muspelheim and the ice of Niflheim. Creation forged in tension, balanced on the edge of opposites. Inside the longhouse, that cosmic story repeated every night. Fire on one side, cold pressing in from the other. Between them, a family endured. Beside the chieftain's high seat stood two carved wooden pillars called Undvegissulur. These were not mere decorations. They were spiritual anchors, markers of ancestry, power, and fate. Their carvings told stories of lineage, gods, journeys, and the unbroken chain of memory that bound each generation to the last. When Norse settlers arrived in Iceland, they performed a ritual that fused faith with practicality. They cast their Öndvegisúlur into the sea and followed them to shore, believing the gods themselves would choose where they built their new home. Where the pillars landed, the Longhouse would rise. Where the Longhouse stood, the family would root its future. To outsiders, it might seem like superstition, but to the Vikings, it was guidance, a way of ensuring that human effort aligned with divine will. Because a house was far more than a roof or walls. It was identity carved into earth. It was lineage carried across oceans. It was a promise. To ancestors behind them, to descendants ahead of them, and to the harsh northern world that demanded strength for every breath taken within its borders. The Longhouse was shelter, yes, but it was also story, spirit, and destiny under a single sod-covered roof. For centuries, the Viking Longhouse system held strong. Through storms, famine, scares, and brutal northern winters, it endured. It was not comfortable, but it was reliable. A thermal machine pushed to its limits, yet still able to protect the people who depended on it. But then came the Little Ice Age. A shift of only 1 or 2 degrees, barely noticeable in the modern world, was enough to collapse the fragile balance the Norse had built their lives upon. Fields that once yielded barley and hay shrank under colder skies. Cattle grew weaker, burning more calories than they could consume. Fish changed their migration routes, moving beyond reach. Trading ships, once lifelines to Europe, stopped arriving as sea ice spread and storms worsened. Isolation deepened like a wound. The Longhouse had never been a luxury. It was already operating at maximum efficiency. There was no extra insulation to add, no new wood to harvest, no farmland left to claim, no hidden reserves to draw from. When the environment tightened its grip, there was simply nothing left to adjust. And so Greenland, once a bold frontier of Norse exploration, was slowly abandoned. Not in flames, not in violence, not in a single catastrophic night, but in a long, quiet unraveling. The mathematics of survival no longer added up. This is how most civilizations end. Not with explosions that echo across history, but with exhaustion. The slow fading of a system pushed beyond what it was ever designed to endure. The Norse were not defeated. They were drained, worn down by a climate that shifted just enough to make the old solutions obsolete. Their engineering hadn't failed. The world around them had changed. Today, we live in a world that rushes to eliminate discomfort. We insulate, automate, climate control, and panic at the first hint of inconvenience. But the Vikings lived with a different expectation. That hardship was not an exception, but the baseline of life. The cold did not surprise them. They prepared for it with a level of discipline that feels almost alien today. Every night was treated as the potential worst night. Every winter was a threat they respected, not a challenge they tried to overpower. Their homes were never truly warm. They were simply warm enough. Not cozy, not pleasant, but survivable. And in the north, survivable was victory. Maybe that is the message the Longhouse carries across 1,000 years. That humanity endures not by defeating nature, but by negotiating with it. By listening to the land, not conquering it. By bending to reality, not pretending we are above it. These people endured winters that should have erased them. They did it not with advanced tools or modern technology, but with adaptation, cooperation, and an acceptance that comfort is temporary, while resilience must be permanent. Their architecture, their rituals, their diets, their social structures, all served one purpose: to survive a world that did not care whether they lived or died. What they knew, and what we often forget, is that the human species was built for endurance. And the Longhouse is proof of that endurance. A quiet reminder that strength is not the absence of hardship, but the ability to live through it, again and again. We explore ancient skills not to escape into the past, but because the past still whispers answers the modern world has forgotten to hear. As we face new extremes, heat, cold, disaster, scarcity, the wisdom of those who survived with almost nothing becomes more than history. It becomes instruction. Their solutions were simple, but never shallow. Their resilience was hard-earned, and their understanding of nature, its limits, its power, its indifference, remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago. If this journey helped you reconnect with the forgotten engineering, courage, and human spirit of our ancestors, we invite you to keep exploring with us. There is so much more waiting beneath the surface of time. This is Primal Heritage, where the past doesn't disappear. It stands beside us, offering guidance, quietly reminding us who we were and who we still can be.